Mark Newman and Jerry Levy were identical twins, raised apart from birth, and reunited as adults. They met for the first time at the age of 31, when somebody who saw Jerry realized how similar he looked to his friend Mark. It turned out that both twins installed equipment in hotels and restaurants, and both twins were volunteer firefighters. They both drank Budweiser beer, holding the can or the glass with the pinky finger underneath for support. And they both ate Chinese food, and they would eat steak, but only if served exceedingly rare. And the list goes on and on. I was very privileged to study these twins when they came to Minneapolis for the Minnesota study of twins raised apart. And I was very struck by Mark's comment that meeting Jerry for the first time was like seeing an old friend after being away on vacation. They had to fill in the details, but the basis for the relationship was there at the moment of meeting. Now, what about Elvis Presley? Did you know that he was a twin? His twin brother, Jesse Garon, died shortly after birth, and it was a loss that Elvis felt very intensely for his entire life. We can understand his grief as reflecting the loss of a potentially meaningful relationship. And we can wonder, if Jesse had lived and played alongside Elvis, would those performances have dazzled us even more than those that Elvis turned in on his own? And what about Liberace, known for his musical talents and outlandish costumes? He also lost a twin brother shortly after birth, and we can wonder here too, if they had played together, would this have amplified even the most compelling of performances? And finally, we come to Ed Sullivan, the legendary TV show host, who lost his twin brother Daniel at the age of 2, leaving us just one twin to bring us years of marvelous TV entertainment. We need to pay attention to these twin stories because they tell us a lot about our own relationships, who we love, who we like, and who we loathe. You know, it seems strange that Mark and Jerry should form such a close attraction to someone they just met, and that Elvis Presley should mourn the loss of someone he never met. And yet, by paying attention to these twins, we can better understand why some of our relationships work so well and others are doomed to failure. Now, twins form a natural science experiment, and they come in two types: identical twins and fraternal twins. Identical twins share all their genes, and they look very much alike. Fraternal twins share half their genes on average, and most of them look quite different, and some even look unrelated. Twins have been pivotal in psychological and medical research, and that is because the twin method is a simple and elegant way of disentangling genetic and environmental influences on behavior. And that is why you see them infiltrating fields like behavioral economics, political science, even religious studies. And what researchers like myself do is to compare the similarities of identical twins and fraternal twins. If identical twins are more alike, this tells us that the genes influence the development of that particular trait. But twins can also be used creatively to understand the environment. If we have groups of identical twins who differ in some way, in a psychological trait like motivation, or a behavioral trait like intelligence, or maybe a physical trait like height, we can look at those traits and try to figure out what factors cause the difference between those twins. And we can use that information to assist and inform the non-twin population. Because after all, twin research is not just for twins. It's a model, an approach for understanding human development in general. Now, most researchers like myself find that identical twins are more alike in virtually everything that we can measure: intelligence, personality, height, weight, disease, even financial investment. And even in unusual signature quirks, and even in twins raised apart from birth. What this tells us is that our own unusual habits have a partial genetic basis, but it also helps us understand why some of our family members are so alike and some are so very different. Now, most researchers like myself do find that identical twins are more alike, but we also find that identical twins share a closer relationship with one another, and they work together much better than fraternal twins do. And I first began to think about this when I did my very first twin study. And that was a study at the University of Chicago where I compared work decision tasks between identical and fraternal twin children between the ages of 7 and 13. So what I did was to bring jigsaw puzzles to the homes of all these twins with the instruction, solve it together. And what I found was absolutely amazing. The identical twins would take the pieces, keep them equidistant between them. They cooperated, they checked on each other's work, they monitored one another, and they smiled a lot. But the fraternal twins, in contrast, you see on your right, took the pieces to their side of the table, giving the impression of two separate puzzles being solved. They struggled over pieces, they elbowed each other, they didn't smile as much. And it was not the joyous occasion that it was for the identicals. So what this suggested to me was that it was the similarities between these identical twins that enabled that close cooperation and lack of competition. And I would even go a step further and say it was the perception of those similarities that really formed the social glue that bound them together and kept them close. And I think the message in that for everybody is that we will cooperate better with people with whom we share common interests and attitudes and abilities. Now, what about friendship? And then we'll get on to love, which is everybody's favorite topic. So with friendship, what we find is that identical twins have greater friendship overlap in fraternal twins, meaning that they share more friends in common. And after a short time, they forget who met the twin first. We also find that the twins pick similar friends, which makes perfect sense because the twins themselves are so similar. And again, this suggests to us that we pick our friends based on commonalities that we see. But fraternal twins actually move in very different social circles. And as I said many times, I should know that because I'm a fraternal twin who complained to my mother that I had no one to play with because it hadn't occurred to me to play with my sister. But studies have shown that fraternal twin girls feel rejected by their sister and by the sister's friends, prefer to play alone than with each other, and tend to have to negotiate their differences on a day-to-day basis. Now, on to love. I'm a consultant to the Brazilian twin projects in Sao Paulo and throughout the country. And a number of years ago, I met these identical twins, a Dalton and a Dalton, and their wives. And the twins told me that while they liked their sisters-in-law, that is the woman that their twin brother married, they could never imagine marrying them. And the wives told me that while they liked their brothers-in-law, they couldn't never imagine marrying them. And at first, this seemed odd to me because I assumed that the identical twins were just simply genetically interchangeable. But that is not the case at all, because subtle differences in demeanor, in temperament, in attitude, in approach make huge differences when it comes to mate selection. And I've also been fascinated with identical twins who marry identical twins. We hear about these stories more and more in the press. And what's most fascinating about them is that the pairings occur so rapidly and quickly and effortlessly. And I'm fascinated by knowing what is the process that enables that. So I did speak to one husband from that foursome, and he told me that when he met his future wife, she was the one with the sweeter, gentler face relative to her sister and had a less dominant personality, which was better suited to his own temperament. So I think we're starting to get a handle on this. But I think the bottom line for all of us is that subtle differences make huge differences when it comes to who we love and who we like. Now, let's go on to the downside of love relationships, and that is the loss of a relationship. I have an ongoing study of over 700 twin survivors who lost a twin at the age of 14 or older. And what I find is that twins, whether identical or fraternal, rate the loss of their twin at the highest level and higher than any other relative who died in their lifetime, including parents, non-twin siblings, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. I also find that identical twins do mourn the loss of their twin somewhat more than the fraternal twins do. And that's not terribly surprising, because that would mirror the relationship they had while they were alive. And I think that the message here for all of us is that there are individual differences in a family in bereavement when a family member passes away. You know, it would not be too surprising to expect a daughter to mourn more for a father than a granddaughter to a grandfather, because of the relationship that they share. And it seems that in bereavement, we have to try to understand what is the reason for this. How can we make sort of theoretical understanding of this? And I think we need to borrow from the theory of evolution, evolutionary psychology, and think about two types of explanations, proximal and ultimate. Proximal explanations refer to those that are the immediate everyday interactions we have. A mother making lunch for a child, a father picking up his children from school, the things that give us pleasure and keep the relationship moving. But then we have the ultimate explanations, which are those that refer to our biological fitness, our getting our genes into subsequent populations through the production of viable offspring. Now, we don't consciously calculate these things in our head. We only act as though we do, according to Richard Dawkins. But it took the genius of William Hamilton to say, not only do we get our genes directly into the population through our own reproduction, but through the reproduction of relatives with whom we share genes in common, such as a twin versus a cousin. And so it might make better biological sense to be kind to a closer relative than to a more distant one. Now, earlier I said that twins mourn the loss of their twin more than any other relative. But there is one exception to that, which I saved for now, and that is the loss of a spouse, which identical and fraternal twin rate at the highest level, equal to the twin and equal to each other. And that sounds strange at first, because spouses don't share genes. But yet, if you think about the spouse as a vehicle for getting your genes into subsequent populations, then we might hear what David Barish has called the wail of frustrated genes. At this point, it's worth mentioning to you that sibling loss in general, and twin loss in particular, have been largely neglected by bereavement researchers and by bereavement counselors. And I think that's probably because twins are still a relative minority in the population, and they focused on children, parents, infants, things of that sort, which of course are devastating losses. But it's taken twins and their families to bring attention to this terrible loss. So in Canada, we have CLIMB, the Center for Loss and Multiple Birth, which is targeted to women who lose a twin just before birth, at birth, or shortly thereafter. In the US, we have the Twinless Twins Support Group International, which operates at local, state, and national levels. I spoke at one of their national meetings, and what absolutely amazed me was the understanding that everyone showed to everyone else without any need for explanation. And as the meeting progressed, I saw that people kind of coalesced into groups based on commonality: identical twin loss, fraternal twin loss, age, sex, cause of loss, things of that sort. So I really encourage and admire the evolution of these very specialized support groups. Now, I want to move on to co-twin collaboration. And as I said earlier, we find that identical twins do seem to collaborate more often and more efficiently than fraternal twins do. And in my forthcoming book, I've interviewed a number of twins on this point. Here are twins Peter and Will Anderson, who are absolutely the greatest jazz musicians I've ever heard. And they told me that it is honesty, communication, and just having fun that enables their effective communication and their ability to play together and write songs and all of that. Other twin musicians have told me the same thing, but also say that it's a lot harder to collaborate with anyone outside the twinship because you can't exactly be yourself and feel completely free and can't be completely honest. For this reason, there are many more identical twin co-authors, co-artists, co-physicians. I can name many. And what strikes me about them so deeply is the mutuality of their final product. You know, the writers tell me that they don't care whose name comes first on the cover. If I wrote a book with my sister, I would care. The artists say that they compose a canvas together and they don't know who did what part when the rest was finished. And I spoke to identical twins, now physicians, but when they were in high school, both ran for high school president. And only one of them won, and the other one said, now we can be president. So I think these are important. Now, I can also give you some really nice other examples. If you remember the 1984 Olympics, Steve and Phil Mayer, the Olympic skiers on the slalom. Phil turned in what he thought was a gold medal winning performance, turned to his brother and said, here's what you had to do to beat me. And in 2014, we had identical twins, Tracy and Lanny Barnes, who both hoped to win a spot on the US biathlon team. Well, Tracy made the cut and Lanny did not. So Tracy gave her position to her sister. Imagine that. And when asked why, she said, Lanny deserved it. And she said, in a way, I'll be competing too. And in a way, she was right. Now, the last point I want to make has to do with these little guys here. They look like they come from different populations. In fact, the press has called them the biracial twins. There's nothing biracial about them. They are ordinary fraternal twins born to a Caucasian mother, an African-American father. But it struck me that these twins may give us clues to how we all get along, which I know is a very timely topic these days. Perhaps growing up with somebody who looks so different from you and is so different from you is a way towards greater tolerance, respect, and mutual understanding. Thank you very much.